Racial justice and racism really has been the lens through which I have viewed the world for the past 2 decades. And for a lot of that time, I did that from a place of distancing from my own identity as a white and then a white Jewish woman. And then years later, I traveled to Palestine and I witnessed the occupation, the Israeli occupation of Palestine firsthand. And it was the most painful thing I've ever witnessed. That awakening that I had to racism and to my role in it. And I came back from that trip and I carried a deeply broken heart about the intersections of these systems, about the intersections of anti-Semitism, of racism, of white supremacy, of my implicit benefit from these systems that are really part of the same systems that killed my ancestors in the Holocaust.
One big struggle and work that I was confronted with was basically the realization of we are not the poor ones and the weak ones. Coming from an Israeli background, together with a Jewish background, my upbringing was saturated with narratives around, as Jews, we are the best, the chosen people, the people of God, like the first nation, all of this. And on the other hand, together with that, we are being persecuted and hated for being exactly that. And therefore, everybody who is not a Jew, as I was taught, is fundamentally inferior to us. For me, this was the whole narrative of how much at the top we are, and at the same time how much wrong is being done to us by everybody else who hates us. These two came together in a very strong way for me. I also want to say, it's important for me to say that I am not speaking in the name of Israelis or in the name of Jews. I'm speaking from my experience, and that's all.
When I was a kid, I was scared to tell anybody I was Jewish. I pretty much did everything I could to pretend that I wasn't Jewish or didn't appear to be Jewish because I was just so scared of what the repercussions would be. And so coming into my acknowledging in a more full way my Jewish heritage has been a journey throughout my life. And so I feel the reality of what it is to be a target of white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And I also very strongly feel the privilege that it is to be in a white body and to identify as a white woman and to move through the world with the privileges of what it is to be a white woman. And so I feel those intersections in me strongly and have learned a lot from them.
I think I felt as someone who'd grown up as a Jew in a predominantly white Christian centric culture, I really identified with this, my Jewishness also as an oppressed identity. So I felt in a kind of like, oh yeah, I know what it's like to be oppressed. So I've already done my work. And so there was just a lot of humility that came, that is still continuing to come and wake up inside of myself around how much work I have to do as someone who's white presenting, white skinned in this country, how much privilege I walk with, and being someone who is Caucasian or white, which, that checking that box off throughout my life has always felt very strange because I didn't feel white and Caucasian. I didn't relate to what I saw as white around me, but I very much was and do benefit from all the privileges of kind of getting to disappear into the sea of whiteness.
It's interesting when you ask about struggles, because there were things I only recognized were struggles later. So coming in and learning about just how difficult it is for black-bodied people in a white supremacist culture, how quickly I would make an equation between, yeah, that sounds familiar from being Jewish in a non-Jewish, largely anti-Semitic culture. So that equation happened very quickly, and a very quick sense of, oh yeah, I know a bit like what that feels like. And then later realizing, wow, I'm really jumping there. I'm equating my own experience of vulnerability, of living with a certain base level of fear. I'm equating that with someone who walks around in a black body in a white supremacist culture. So that would be, I think, one of the points. And what really helped was Layla Saad's question of what mental gymnastics have you done to avoid feeling the discomfort of recognizing your own white fragility or white supremacy. And the term mental gymnastics really got me. It's like, well, that's what I'm doing. I'm making my own discomfort and my hereditary experience of vulnerability and persecution. I'm bringing that into the present, which isn't my current lived experience, in order to defend myself against realizing how much prejudice I have and how much I am supported by a system of white supremacy, and how much I even I use it. I use the privilege. I use the assumption that is projected onto me that as a white woman, I'm okay, I'm respectable. But I didn't want to see that because it was more comfortable to see myself as non-complicit.
I think we still haven't packed how limiting the intergenerational anti-Semitism that we either personally experience or are bred with can be in terms of creating more empathy and compassion. I think, for some of us, and this is my family, so I can't speak for all white Jewish families, there was a sense of like, we take care of our own, we're constantly under threat. We may not exist, so we have to be strong and we have to take care of our own, and other people have to take care of themselves. And, as much as sometimes it could create a sense of like strong tribalism amongst white Jews, it's kind of sometimes where the tribalism and empathy and compassion end. So I think there's a lot of unprocessed individual and community trauma wrapped up in our inability to get beyond ourselves too.
There is a term used like the first Israel, the second Israel, the third Israel, which the first Israel is the Ashkenazis who came from Europe. The second Israel are the Jewish people who arrived from North Africa, Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, Egypt. And then the third Israel, which is in the 90s, there was a big wave of Jewish people coming from Russia. There is like all of this, and then the Palestinians, which is like at all out of discussion.
The racism within the Jewish community, for me growing up, was so big and so deep. I remember it even as a child, that I was taught that the Ashkenazim would be more likely to be, first of all, nicer safer to be around. They would be better skilled with money, with leading people, better educated, as they come from a better background. Where the Mizrahim, from all different backgrounds, would be the problematic kids growing up, the ones that would never sit still and would become violent verbally and physically, less likely to finish high school actually and have a diploma. I remember even in elementary school being told to keep away from them as much as, like, keep a safe distance because it's not safe. And so I realized that when I grew up, I wasn't aware of it, but there is a very strong hierarchy, very strong, and one that I'm at the top of. From my background, I'm considered at the top of that hierarchy, and that made me completely blind to even see the hierarchy and see the discrimination and oppression that others were going through. This creates a very clear distinction and separation between what is like the higher level of Israeli Jew, which is the Ashkenazi, and then the Mizrahi is not that. It is already a definition that generalizes all the people who don't have the privilege to be called Ashkenazim and puts them all together, erases all different stories and backgrounds and cultures and just puts them in a second grade category for people.
I don't think that my identity as a white Jewish woman counters or conflicts or negates any of the patterns of whiteness that also exist in my body from being a white person raised in a white supremacist system. I think some of the ways that I should see whiteness and patterns of white supremacy show up in me is especially in moments of if I feel like something maybe needs to be interrupted or challenged, being afraid that if I actually speak up and break white solidarity, that then I will lose belonging or like be kicked out of the group. And I think that especially for white Jewish women, because I think there is such a history of feeling like not belonging or like they're going to be kicked out of the group or targeted as different, that fear can then come up so strongly that it can relate to moments of not actually interrupting other moments of racial harm.
I can kind of pass as mainstream kind of white Protestant. I can pass as that as long as certain parts of myself aren't visible. So I hold myself in a certain tension. And if I think about how that then contributes to participating in a just very mainstream white racism, and also a failure to then participate in anti-racism, what I notice is when it would be time to speak up, I can get really careful and say, it's not safe to speak up because then my otherness will also be visible, and then I'll get the punishment that somehow I've been waiting for. But from the outside, what that looks like is another white woman not speaking. So there's a felt experience of vulnerability that is uncommunicated, and then the experience from the outside is just another silent white woman.
We as white-skinned Jewish Americans have so much of our own work to do on a deep somatic level to metabolize the generations of oppression. And that is really important work, is valid, is like, we have got our work to do for sure. And the ways that I've seen harm caused in anti-racist workings is when we are bringing that work into anti-racism workshops and centering it. There's a time and a place for it to be centered. It deserves and is worthy of that. But it's not, for me, what I'm finding is it's not in anti-racism workshops that I need to center that. And I think the harm that's caused or that we're causing is when we're not doing that work on a deep somatic level to be able to tolerate in our bodies the amount of trauma we're walking with, that we then cause harm in those spaces because we're hungry for that healing ourselves.
I can remember the first time that I was invited to be a part of an affinity group where they invited Jewish people to come to the group that was identified as targets of white supremacy. And it did something for me in my body, the recognition of that, because it is a fear that I live with daily, and I had to overcome as a child, where I really didn't want to admit that I was Jewish publicly at all. And also, I feel very accountable to the privileges that I carry as a white woman and what it means to be benefiting from and upholding the white supremacist systems.
As white bodies, having to recognize our complicity in the most horrific system of violence that is still continuing, it is so deeply uncomfortable. And if there's a system that doesn't believe it has an entitlement or responsibility or a requirement to work with discomfort, then you have that, a light version is a kind of an awkwardness and a resistance. And I guess more intensely, just an outrage. How can you expect me to engage in this? And then if one puts the kind of the Jewish history, which I know in my own experience can get collapsed as if it's my experience, then it's, how can you expect me to deal with this given what my people have had to endure? So it then flips into a moral outrage.
I'm thinking of one example. We were exploring how whiteness and patterns of whiteness show up in the body. And what I saw in this one white Jewish woman is she kept feeling the need to consistently speak to how she's Jewish and how she's a woman, and bring in stories and moments where she had felt harmed or silenced or hurt or oppressed, and that those stories then became like most of the story in her share, like all of that qualification and centering of that experience needed to come out first before she was actually able to get to looking at like, well, and how does whiteness show up in me and what am I working on? One thing I have seen also is that sometimes we never actually get there. Like it stays stuck in just the experience of victim. And I think that it's important to, acknowledge that those stories are real.
It came so fast that I didn't even notice it was a strategy. It's like, no, that doesn't apply to me because I have this in my family. But something about wanting to protect the truth of that experience against being wiped off the table so we can have another conversation, because that experience is often wiped off the table so we can have another conversation. So something about kind of wanting to hold on to that a bit, and at the same time knowing, you know what, now it's about pigment. Now this is about color. And while that history has its validity, it's just not what we're talking about now, Juliet.
I see two pathways of the defense. I see one that both rooted in a lot of, we'll call it anxiety, but a lot of aliveness, a lot of full-bodied sensation, and one manifests as silence, of just like backing up and not saying anything anymore. Maybe even like seething resentment underneath. And the other one moves more towards rage, getting defensive in a way of, I don't like not feeling seen. And so I'm going to erupt because you don't get me. You don't understand. And yeah, I've seen both of those pathways and experienced and perpetuated both of them myself in conversations around race.
Some of the behaviors I've noticed in that cycle of getting stuck, a big one is defensiveness, or aggression that can also come out. Like oftentimes body posture might shift, and like I'm thinking of this, in this example, the woman like got really kind of like puffed up in the chest, and it felt like a posture of, I'm going to tell you, like, don't tell me. And then I've also seen, similarly in this same example I'm thinking about, the body posture change more to like scared or defeated. And then I've watched somatically that it can be hard to get out of either one of those postures to then like recenter and find a place of dignity or of peace, to continue the conversation or the self-inquiry or the cross-racial or cross-relational dialogue. When we've been harmed, it's almost more painful to imagine that we also could be and are causing harm. And that reckoning inside is so essential and also can be painful. It is true that I have been caused harm as a Jewish woman and as a woman. And it's also true that as a white woman and a white Jewish woman, I also have caused harm just by being who I am and upholding patterns of whiteness.
The biggest crux that I have found is that it's in the body that both of these live, right? So the victim and the perpetrator, and experiencing both at the same time. And I'm remembering being in a weekend workshop, working with Ken Hardy, Robin DeAngelo, and speaking out in a moment and sharing something of my lineage, of my history, of my father, who had been, as a kid, some kids had hung a rope around his neck. And I shared this story in the company of many people of color. And the trauma that lives in my body is very real for my lineage. The place where that was an act that was done by the kids in the neighborhood as an act of an anti-Semitic act. And the complexity of then bringing that into the company of folks, a lot of Black people, a lot of people of color who come from a lineage of lynching. And so the way that showed up in the room for me was like, hey, I have this trauma in my body, and I want to be known that like this is something I'm grappling with, and almost as a way to minimize and equate what my story is with the story of the people in the room, as a way to get close to and to show that like I am an ally and I can be trusted. But actually what that did was it created so much ripples of harm in the room. And what was shown to me was the way that I had brought in that story, that sacred story, as a way, because of where I had brought it, not that the story itself doesn't warrant its own work in its own time and space to be witnessed and held and like metabolized for sure, but that I had brought it into a place with in mixed caucuses, like with mixed races, as a way to equate my story with your story. So I'm gonna like minimize what's happening over here for you so we can be on equal footing.
In high school, we have journeys to Poland and Germany to visit the concentration camps. And I have twins brothers. They are 15 years younger than me. And a few years ago, they were 17. In this year in high school where you go on this journey. And I realized that this journey is put in the same year where you start your application into the IDF, into the Israeli army. Also, I can speak a lot about the Israeli army, but I can move it aside. But just I realized that there's like how you anchor a narrative into youth in order to guarantee their compliance with the system.
The struggle for me was to somehow get over the story that we are right, we are the few, and everybody is out there to get us, and so we are the ones being oppressed, which is also true on some levels. But to shift from that to see how much we are on the oppressing side, what kind of war we are inflicting onto the Palestinian people with the claim of this is not our fault, we are only defending ourselves, we are the innocent ones, we are the righteous ones who need to deal with those primitive savages who only want war.
I think that one thing that comes up a lot, especially with white Jewish women, is this sort of paradox where it can seem like there's only two ends of the spectrum of dominance. There's superiority, and then there's inferiority, and so there can be like this sort of ping pong back between those two expressions. And I think that those aren't the only two ways. And I think that we have to get out of the polar binary of dominance and then submission. Like that's not the only way.
So I am second generation on my father's side. My father was raised in Brooklyn, on the Bronx, on welfare by a single mother who had fled the pogroms of Poland to come to the US. And my dad had this giant leap of privilege in his lifetime. And so I grew up hearing stories of all of the family members who didn't make it over, the stories I heard is that there were pictures of them in my grandmother's house, and that one by one she would get word, she would get telegrams, and the pictures would get turned down. I was brought up assimilated. I had a disconnect from the Orthodox kosher home that my dad was raised in, and I was raised in a pretty assimilated middle class home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. This giant leap in privilege, which I now understand comes from the intersection of patriarchy and of white supremacy. About 5 years ago, had a vision of my ancestors. It was a vision of my ancestors going into the ovens. And there was this clear message that I am here to do this work for social justice, for racial justice, because my ancestors were killed because of another kind of white supremacy. And I feel this strong calling to work to dismantle white supremacy in its form today. And I realized after many years of pushing my own people away, first pushing white people away and then pushing Jewish people away, that if this work was really important to me, I needed to come home. I needed to come home to my people.